The grand hall was bathed in golden light, the chandeliers casting delicate reflections on the polished marble floor. Isabella stood near the head of the room, her white gown shimmering as though woven from moonlight. The guests clinked glasses filled with champagne, their laughter blending with the soft strains of a live orchestra. It was a scene straight out of a fairy tale, a culmination of Isabella's dreams. But behind her radiant smile, Isabella fought the gnawing nerves creeping in her chest. This wasn't merely a celebration of love but also a testament to how far she had come. From the small town of Meadow Hill to this glittering ballroom, she had clawed her way into high society, reinventing herself into the poised and sophisticated woman everyone admired. As she looked across the room, her eyes caught glimpses of her past woven into the crowd. Her parents sat stiffly at a table near the back, their clothes elegant but slightly outdated. She'd insisted they come but had placed them far enough from the high-profile guests to avoid undue scrutiny. Her best friend from childhood, Claire, waved shyly from another table, her dress modest but her smile warm. Isabella breathed in deeply. This day was about her and her future husband, Charles, an accomplished lawyer from a well-known family. He was everything she'd worked for, handsome, intelligent, and a perfect match for the life she'd carefully curated. As the toasts began, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was her moment, and nothing could ruin it. Or so she thought. At the far corner of the room, a man stood apart from the other guests. His attire, while formal, lacked the polished air of everyone else. His eyes, sharp and familiar, scanned the room, finally landing on Isabella. Daniel. The sight of him made her heart drop. She hadn't seen him in years, and his presence here was an anomaly. Daniel wasn't just a reminder of her past, he was the embodiment of everything she had tried to leave behind. She hadn't invited him, there was no way she would. How had he even gotten in? She stole a glance at the guest list on the table, her hand trembling slightly. His name was nowhere to be found. As the evening progressed, Isabella avoided him, but Daniel's presence felt like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. When their eyes met across the room, she saw something she hadn't expected, not resentment, not sadness, but a quiet challenge. The moment came during the cutting of the cake. As Isabella and Charles held the knife together, Daniel approached. His steps were deliberate, his posture confident. The crowd fell silent as he raised his voice. "Isabella," he said, his tone steady but cutting, "do you even remember who you used to be?" Gasps rippled through the room. Isabella's face flushed with a mix of anger and humiliation. "Excuse me?" she replied, her voice quivering but sharp. "I think you've had too much to drink." Daniel shook his head, a bitter smile on his lips. "Too much to drink? No, Isabella. I just came here to see if the girl I once knew was still inside you, or if she's been buried completely under all this." He gestured around the room, his voice rising. "Do these people even know where you come from?" The whisper started, the judgmental eyes turning toward her. Charles tightened his grip on her hand, his confusion evident. Isabella wanted to scream, to lash out, but all she could do was stand frozen as Daniel's words echoed in her ears. Meadow Hill was a quaint town nestled in a valley surrounded by rolling hills. Its charm lay in its simplicity, a single main street lined with small businesses, a park with a worn but cherished playground, and a community that seemed to know every detail of each other's lives. It was in this quiet town that Isabella grew up, her early years defined by modesty and warmth. Her parents, hardworking but struggling financially, did their best to provide for her. Isabella, with her bright eyes and boundless ambition, dreamed of a life far beyond the confines of Meadowhill. She spent hours poring over glossy magazines, imagining herself in the elegant clothes and luxurious settings of the women in the pages. Daniel had been her closest friend during those years. With his wild curls and quick wit, he had a knack for making her laugh even when times were tough. They shared secrets under the oak tree by the river, swearing that no matter what happened, they would always be there for each other. But life had other plans. When Isabella received a scholarship to an elite private school, it was as if her dreams had finally found a path to reality. She packed her bags with trembling hands, excitement bubbling in her chest. But as she boarded the bus leaving Meadowhill, she couldn't bring herself to look back. Daniel had been there to see her off, his smile forced and his eyes clouded with an emotion she couldn't place. "Don't forget us," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "Don't forget who you are." Isabella nodded, but deep down, she already felt herself drifting away from the person she'd been. At her new school, Isabella worked tirelessly to fit in. She adjusted her accent, learned the social codes, and buried her small-town roots. Letters from Meadowhill went unanswered. And Daniel's voice, once a comforting presence, became a distant echo in her mind. Years passed, and Isabella blossomed into the image of sophistication she had always dreamed of. She graduated at the top of her class, secured a prestigious job, and eventually met Charles, whose family opened doors she never imagined entering. But with every success, a part of her felt hollow. She silenced that voice, focusing instead on building the perfect life. Meadowhill became a distant memory, and the friendships she once cherished faded into obscurity. Daniel, however, had not forgotten. Isabella's perfectly curated world began to crumble as Daniel's words echoed in her mind long after the wedding. The whispers among the guests hadn't stopped. She could feel their eyes following her every move. Even Charles, usually composed, seemed uneasy, his hand pulling away from hers more than once. "What did he mean by who you used to be?" Charles asked in their suite later that night. Isabella hesitated, searching for the right words. "He's just an old friend from my hometown," she finally said, her voice carefully neutral. "I think he was upset about not being invited." But the doubt in Charles's eyes stung more than any judgment from the guests. Alone in the dark, Isabella replayed the confrontation. Daniel's gaze, sharp and unrelenting, seemed to pierce through her carefully constructed facade. For the first time in years, she found herself questioning the choices that had brought her to this moment. The unease lingered for weeks. Isabella buried herself in charity events and high society galas, but Daniel's words wouldn't leave her. She tried to distract herself by organizing fundraisers, spending hours planning dinner menus, but her heart wasn't in it. One evening, as she sifted through an old photo album, a picture of her and Daniel under the oak tree fell into her lap. They were grinning, their faces smeared with dirt from a failed attempt to catch frogs. It was a moment frozen in time, before ambition, before expectations, before she had left him behind. It was then that Isabella made a decision. She needed to return to Meadowhill, not for Daniel, but for herself. She had to confront the person she used to be to understand the person she had become. Meadowhill hadn't changed much. The main street still had its charming but worn-down shops, the park was just as she remembered, and the same old oak tree stood by the riverbank. But to Isabella, it felt like stepping into a time capsule that she no longer belonged to. She parked her sleek car by the general store, feeling the stares of locals as she stepped out. Some recognized her and greeted her warmly, others seemed to watch with thinly veiled suspicion. Isabella plastered on a polite smile, but inside, she felt like an intruder. At the edge of the park, she saw a group of children playing near the river. For a fleeting moment, she thought of herself and Daniel, laughing and running barefoot through the same field. She shook her head, pushing the memory aside, and made her way toward the old diner where she'd heard Daniel sometimes worked. The diner was small and dimly lit, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's name. Isabella slid into a booth and ordered a coffee, keeping an eye on the kitchen door. When Daniel finally appeared, she almost didn't recognize him. His once unruly curls were cropped short, and there was a seriousness in his face that hadn't been there before. "Isabella?" His voice was neutral, but his eyes betrayed his surprise. He sat across from her, crossing his arms. "What brings you here?" "I came to talk," she said, her voice faltering. "About what happened at the wedding." Daniel leaned back, a bitter smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "What's there to talk about? You left Meadow Hill, you left me, and now you're back for, what? Closure?" His words cut deeper than she expected, and for the first time, she was at a loss for how to respond. Their conversation was brief and strained. Daniel left abruptly, leaving Isabella staring into her untouched coffee. She had thought that seeing him would give her answers, but it had only left her with more questions. As she stepped outside, the setting sun bathed the town in warm light. She wandered aimlessly, her heels clicking against the pavement. She found herself at the edge of the park where the children had left, and the world felt eerily quiet. A soft voice broke her thoughts. "Isabella?" She turned to see Claire, her childhood best friend, holding a basket of groceries. "It's really you," Claire said, her smile warm but tinged with sadness. "I heard you were back." Over coffee at Claire's kitchen table, Isabella recounted her encounter with Daniel. Claire listened quietly, occasionally nodding but offering little reassurance. Finally, she spoke. "You hurt him more than you realize, Isabella. When you left, it wasn't just the town you left behind, it was the people who loved you." Isabella bristled. "I had to leave, Claire. I couldn't stay here and waste my potential." "I know," Claire said softly, "but you didn't have to burn every bridge on your way out." The words stung, but they also planted a seed of understanding. Isabella left Claire's house with a heavy heart, realizing that making amends wouldn't be as simple as showing up. Determined to understand what she had missed, Isabella spent the next few days reconnecting with the town. She visited the school, the church, and the community center, each stop revealing pieces of the life she had left behind. She learned that Daniel had stayed in Meadow Hill, working odd jobs to support his ailing father after his mother passed away. He had dreams of becoming a teacher but had put them on hold indefinitely. The picture of his life that emerged was one of sacrifice and resilience, a stark contrast to the image of bitterness she had clung to. Isabella finally summoned the courage to seek out Daniel again, this time at his home. He answered the door reluctantly, his expression unreadable. "Why are you here, Isabella?" "I want to know why you came to my wedding," she said, her voice steady. Daniel sighed and leaned against the doorframe. "I wanted you to see what you've become. To remind you of who you used to be. But I also needed closure. I needed to say goodbye to the person I once cared about." His honesty left Isabella speechless. For the first time, she saw the depth of his pain and her own role in it. For days after their conversation, Isabella could hardly sleep. Daniel's words lingered in her mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. She had always framed her departure from Meadow Hill as a necessary escape, a bold step toward her future. But now, for the first time, she questioned the cost of her ambition. Sitting by the riverbank under the old oak tree, Isabella let the memories wash over her. She thought of the afternoons spent with Daniel, skipping rocks and sharing dreams, and how effortlessly happy they had been back then. Tears welled up in her eyes as she realized how much she had buried to fit into a life that now felt hollow. Determined to make amends, Isabella decided to start with the town itself. She remembered the struggling community center Daniel had mentioned during their strained conversation. If she could help revitalize it, perhaps she could begin to rebuild the trust she had lost, not just with Daniel, but with Meadow Hill as a whole. Isabella's return to the town council was met with mixed reactions. Some welcomed her with open arms, grateful for her willingness to help. Others, particularly those who had known her before her rise to prominence, were more skeptical. "Why now?" an older man asked pointedly during a meeting. "Why do you care about Meadow Hill after all these years?" Her voice trembled as she replied, "Because this place is a part of me. I didn't realize how much until I came back. I want to give something back, not out of guilt, but out of gratitude." Her sincerity seemed to soften some of the tension in the room. By the end of the meeting, she had secured approval to organize a fundraiser for the community center. The event would be held in the same field where she and Daniel used to play, now overgrown and forgotten. The day of the fundraiser arrived with clear skies and a cool breeze. Isabella stood at the edge of the field, watching as volunteers set up tables and decorations. A makeshift stage had been erected near the old oak tree, and she felt a pang of nervousness as she imagined herself standing there. When it was her turn to speak, Isabella hesitated for a moment, her hands gripping the edges of the podium. "When I left Meadow Hill, I thought I was leaving behind a life that didn't fit me anymore," she began, her voice steady but emotional. "But the truth is, this town shaped me. It gave me the strength and resilience to chase my dreams. I see that now, and I'm sorry for forgetting it." The crowd was silent, their eyes fixed on her. Among them, she spotted Daniel, standing with his arms crossed but his expression softer than she had ever seen it. After the event, Daniel approached her as the crowd dispersed. "That was unexpected," he said, his tone guarded but not unkind. "I meant every word," Isabella replied. "I don't expect you to forgive me overnight, but I want to try. For the town, and for us." Daniel studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Let's start with the town," he said, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. It wasn't much, but it was enough to fill Isabella with hope. As they began working together to restore the community center, Isabella saw a side of Daniel she hadn't noticed before. His quiet determination and ability to connect with people inspired her, reminding her of the qualities she had once admired in him. The grand reopening of the community center was nothing short of magical. The building, freshly painted and filled with new supplies, bustled with life as children played and families gathered. Isabella stood by the door, greeting visitors and basking in the energy of the crowd. Daniel gave a tour of the new facilities, his enthusiasm infectious. "This isn't just a building," he said to a small group. "It's a second chance for so many people." Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel and Isabella found themselves alone by the oak tree. "You've done something good here," Daniel said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "We've done something good," Isabella corrected, smiling at him. With the success of the community center project, Isabella and Daniel began discussing other ways to help Meadow Hill. "What if we started a scholarship fund for local kids?" Isabella suggested one evening as they pored over plans. "Something to help them chase their dreams without having to leave like I did." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. And we could pair it with mentorship programs. Give them the support I wish I'd had back then. As their shared vision for the town grew, so did their bond. Conversations that had once been tense and guarded became warm and collaborative. For the first time in years, Isabella felt like she truly belonged, not to a social circle or a career path, but to a community. One quiet evening, after a long day of work, Daniel invited Isabella to his father's house for dinner. The cozy living room was filled with the scent of home-cooked stew, and the walls were lined with photos from Daniel's childhood. As they ate, Daniel's father shared stories about Daniel's dedication to the town, his sacrifices, and his unshakable loyalty. "You've always had a way of inspiring people," he said to Daniel, his eyes twinkling. Isabella felt a lump rise in her throat. "I'm sorry for not seeing that sooner," she said, turning to Daniel. He smiled gently. "I think I needed time to see it myself," he admitted. "And maybe to forgive." As the weeks passed, the changes in Meadow Hill became impossible to ignore. The once faded community center now buzzed with activity, from after-school programs to workshops for adults looking to build new skills. The scholarship fund was already attracting attention, and several local families had expressed their gratitude to Isabella and Daniel personally. One afternoon, while reviewing applications for the scholarship program, an elderly woman approached Isabella outside the center. Her eyes sparkled with unshed tears. "My grandson wouldn't have dreamed of college if it weren't for this fund," she said, clutching Isabella's hands. "You've given him hope." Isabella's chest tightened with emotion. The praise felt unearned, but it was a reminder that her efforts were finally making a difference. For the first time, she felt a genuine sense of fulfillment, something all the wealth and accolades in her old life had never provided. Isabella and Daniel found themselves spending more time together, their partnership growing into something neither had anticipated. Whether it was repainting a wall at the community center or brainstorming ideas for new projects, they moved with a rhythm that felt effortless. One evening, as they packed up supplies after a long day, Daniel hesitated before speaking. "You've changed, Isabella," he said softly. She paused, looking at him curiously. "Is that a good thing?" "It is," he replied, his gaze steady. "You're not just the girl I used to know, you're more stronger." His words sent a warmth through her she hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to hope that they could be more than just partners in their mission. Just as things seemed to be improving, resistance emerged. Some townsfolk questioned Isabella's motives, accusing her of using the projects to repair her public image rather than out of genuine care. Rumors spread that she was seeking a political position or angling for a high-profile endorsement deal. Daniel overheard some of the whispers while at the diner. "She's only back because it makes her look good," one man said. "She'll leave as soon as she gets what she wants." Frustrated, Daniel confronted Isabella about it. "We can't ignore this," he said, pacing her living room. "We need to show them that you're here to stay." Isabella nodded, her jaw tightening. "Let them talk," she said, though her voice wavered. "I'm not doing this for them, I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do." But the doubt in her own heart lingered, and it wasn't long before the rumors began to affect her confidence. Determined to prove the naysayers wrong, Isabella threw herself into her work with renewed vigor. Daniel, as always, was by her side. Together, they organized a series of public forums where they invited the townspeople to voice their concerns and ideas. At the first forum, the turnout was larger than expected. Isabella stood at the front of the room, nervously smoothing her dress as the crowd murmured, When the first question came, "Why should we trust you?" her heart sank. But before she could answer, Daniel stepped forward. "Because she's here," he said, his voice firm. "She didn't have to come back, but she did. And she's proven, again and again, that she's committed to this town. I've seen it firsthand." His words silenced the room. Isabella, emboldened by his support, stepped forward. "This is my home," she said, her voice steady. "And I'm here for good. Let me prove it to you." The projects in Meadow Hill began attracting attention beyond the town's borders. Journalists from local papers wrote glowing articles about the transformation, and even a national news outlet came to interview Isabella and Daniel. The attention brought new opportunities, including grants and donations from larger organizations. With the influx of resources, they were able to expand their efforts, creating job training programs and opening a small business incubator in the town square. At a celebratory dinner with the town council, Daniel raised a glass. "To Meadow Hill," he said, his smile warm. "And to everyone who believed in what we could achieve." Isabella felt her chest swell with pride. For the first time, she felt truly accepted, not just by the town, but by herself. While sorting through donations one evening, Isabella came across a box of books marked with Daniel's name. Inside was a collection of journals and manuscripts he had written over the years. Curious, she flipped through one and was stunned to find a chapter dedicated to their childhood. The words painted a vivid picture of their time under the oak tree, their shared dreams, and the pain he felt when she left. It was raw, emotional, and deeply personal. Isabella's heart ached as she realized just how much Daniel had carried with him. When she confronted him about it, Daniel looked away, embarrassed. "I didn't mean for you to see that," he said. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because I wasn't ready," he admitted. "But maybe I am now." To cap off their achievements, Isabella and Daniel planned a gala in the city to raise funds for future projects. It was held in a grand ballroom, blending the elegance of Isabella's world with the warmth of Meadow Hill. As the night wore on, Daniel took the stage. "This journey started with a single step," he said, addressing the crowd. "But it grew into something I never imagined, thanks to someone who found her way back home." He turned to Isabella, his eyes shining. "She reminded me, and this town, of what's possible when we dare to dream." Daniel's words struck a chord with everyone in the room. He recounted their shared history, his struggles, and the transformation he had witnessed in Isabella. "When I first saw her again, I was angry," he admitted. "But now, I see someone who didn't just find her way back, she made a new path for all of us to follow." The applause that followed was thunderous, and Isabella felt tears stream down her face. For the first time, she felt fully seen, not as the person she had tried to become, but as the person she truly was. Back in Meadow Hill, Isabella and Daniel walked through the town square, now bustling with life. The community center shone brightly in the distance, a symbol of their shared efforts. "Do you ever think about leaving again?" Daniel asked, his tone teasing. "Not for a second," Isabella replied, smiling up at him. As they stood beneath the oak tree, the laughter of children echoing around them, Isabella realized she had finally found what she'd been searching for all along, a sense of belonging, a purpose, and a place to call home.